Get the Rusty's R-313R, which is part of their RX-300 shock line. They're suitable for and in my case, I'm using them on my Grand Cherokee with 4.5 inches of lift. So that's what they're suited for. After measuring, it does come up with the same measurement that they did suggest it was on the internet, which was good. 2 shocks. And it comes with all the hardware to mount everything how you want it. It actually is pretty neat. They come with 3 different sets of grommet bushings, bushing grommets, excuse me. I think that's what that's called. Or bushing sleeves. You can tell it's early in the morning still. That way, depending on what you're putting it on, you don't run into any issues. One of the shocks that I ordered was missing this hardware kit to hold the reservoir onto the shock. I sent them an email and it was no questions asked. They immediately sent me out a new one. They overnighted it to me. So that was pretty awesome of them. Thumbs up there. So let's go ahead and get it installed. You can tell my Bilsteins are pretty worn out and see how they do. I'm just pressing on them. They seem, because I did have the shock off yesterday or the day before. Just pressing on the 2. This one does seem a little bit more firm. That's exactly what I was looking for. So we'll see what happens here. The RX-300 line of shocks from Rusty's is designed as a monotube shock with a external oil reservoir attached to it. In theory, this should limit a shock fade over time due to the extra capacity of shock oil. Now, there are 3 things in particular I'm looking for in these shocks, one of which is ride quality. Of course, your shocks do determine a lot of your ride quality, both on and off the road. Shock durability, since these will have to take a pounding on the back of the Jeep for a long time. And, of course, overall longevity of life. Of course, you're not going to invest in something as expensive as an external reservoir shock if it's just going to break right off the bat. Now, of course, being a monotube shock, these are not rebuildable, but the price does reflect that pretty well. At the time of this recording, they are $169 a shock, as compared to the $200 or $300 price tag you will get for more expensive rebuildable kits. I guess that's entirely your decision if you need that or not. Although I've had these on the Jeep for about 3 months now, I didn't really have a chance to put them through their paces because the hot season was still declining for the year. Since the hot season is now over, I decided to take them to Sedona to run the Broken Arrow Trail with some friends, because this would provide not only a good gauge as to the amount of abuse they'll take on-road, but some gauge as to the off-road capability of these shocks as well. And I was hoping for a pretty good improvement overall, as the Bilstein 5100s that I had on the back of the Jeep previously were pretty worn out. That's nothing against Bilstein, because those were probably a good 7 years old. I actually bought them used from a friend of mine. So that's, pretty good longevity of life, if you ask me, especially for a heavily abused, off-road shock. A couple of the issues the old shocks would have due to their age and overall level of abuse. First off, there was a lot of exaggerated body roll. Now, what I mean by exaggerated is that compared to other vehicles on the trail or on the road, you would get, it seems like, double the amount of body roll. Although this is a heavy lifted Jeep and some extra body roll makes sense, the amount of body roll that I was getting was far more extreme than what you would expect. Another issue I had was bouncing. Not so much bouncing as in shock fade over time, but rather the back end of the Jeep would just bounce all of the time because of all the weight on it. And as you can guess, that would make you pretty car sick, or, it was pretty unbearable to drive long distances in. I did my last trip to Utah, I drove with this issue, And by the time we got to camp, I was pretty much ready to just drink myself into a bottle because it was that bad. This does get further exaggerated when you have extra weight like camping gear on the Jeep. So that was kind of a big issue. As you can see here, these shocks do a pretty dang good job overall of handling the curves coming into Sedona. If you've ever been to Flagstaff and driven into Sedona, you've probably been this route. And it is quite a bit of switchbacks, turns, and lots of stopping and starting as traffic increases. Overall, so far I can say they handle the highway just as well, and they handle street driving pretty dang well as well. I can't say I have any complaints as far as their on-street performance, and in a minute we'll take a look at their off-road performance as well. So, here we've got the Jeep heading towards Submarine Rock on the Broken Arrow Trail. And the overall off-road performance of these shocks is about as good as I could have hoped for. Being a firm shock, it does a pretty good job of eliminating the exaggerated body roll issue that I was having before. As you can guess, on the trail that would cause a lot of issues with actually hitting and bottoming out, because on larger obstacles, when you have that bump, it would actually bounce and you would land a skid plate on the ground. Obviously that's pretty undesirable, so not having that will be a great relief. And as you can see by this, it's not overly stiff at the same time, even though they were a pretty big pain in the butt to actually get installed because of how stiff they are just by hand. In order to install correctly, I actually had to completely flex the rear axle down to its lowest articulation point, at which point I actually had the disc brake on either side almost touching the ground in order to get these to actually sit in place correctly. Unlike the Bilsteins, where you could compress them and kind of hold them in a compressed state long enough to get the bolts in, these ones were much more energetic in their outward movement. So the only way to really install it was to get them to their full extension, bolt everything in place, and then recompress them. Now, as you can see here, we're coming up to that obstacle going up to Submarine Rock. So this is a pretty good example of how they do on obstacles, on particularly more difficult terrain. On roads and washboard roads, dirt roads, that sort of thing, they do fabulous. So this will be a good show of how they do on other types of terrain. All in all, I have to say I'm pretty pleased with these. If they last anywhere close as long as the Bilsteins do, which I hope they do, then I have to give this 2 thumbs up, but that will be for another video. For now, I'm just giving you this video for your consideration if you're interested in buying these shocks and wondering what the ride quality is like. Well, hopefully the dash cam footage gives you some sort of an idea. I am still running the Bilstein 5100s in the front with the IRO long arms. Eventually, honestly, I'm pretty impressed with these shocks, so I may go to the proper part number for the front end in the RX-300 line, depending on how these shocks hold up in the coming months. I'm very impressed with them so far. So, some more information for your consideration. I did actually contact Rusty several times about these shocks before I purchased them, and according to Rusty's, these are run regularly out of the box at 280 psi. If you need a different setting, you can actually contact them when you purchase them, and they can drop them down as low as 100 psi. 280 is actually pretty stiff compared to most other rebuildable, the rebuildable lines of external reservoir shocks, but I figure because this is kind of a special instance, being a non-rebuildable monotube shock, they must have an idea as to why it's so stiff, or at least why there's so much pressure. All in all, I have to say, though, that the ride is pretty comfortable, and the extra pressure doesn't seem to affect performance in any way. These aren't overly rough as compared to some of the other shocks that I've had a chance to try. And let's take a listen to my on-trail review. Back in the dirt, it drives so much better than it did, though. You know, yeah, and then the shocks are much stiffer, so it doesn't over-exaggerate the bumps and everything. It's nice. Well, all in all, that's it for today, and I hope that this has been a good preview for your consideration. We'll see you next time, and have a good one.